Hi everyone, the name's Nat, and welcome to Thursday webinars. These are educational sessions which help to entertain and illuminate subjects related to neurodivergence. The basic premise is to get really complex subjects, make them super simple and digestible for everyone, essentially put the neurodiverse person back in the driving seat. Because when we originally came up with diagnostic labels and all this technical malarkey terminology, it was essentially created from a neurotypical perspective in order to classify those who were a little bit different. And it's time about we reclaim it a little bit. Knowledge is power, and hence why we're doing it. Well, today we are focusing on autism, and we will go into the depths of what makes autism autism. Where did it even come from? Who are you, autism? Those are the type of things that we are going to be looking at today. Blah-de-blah, we're used to all this stuff now. Here's a lovely team. We're experts via experience. We're also qualified professionals. I'm currently doing my master's in neuroscience, hence where a lot of this information has come from. This is a great way to embed learning and also share knowledge. Today, we've got myself in the chat. We also have April in the chat. Our last webinar we did the other week, we're still editing, but we do have a surprise webinar, which you would not have attended. So we did one called Neurodiversity and Talent Management. This was aimed at people who work in recruiting, but I thought it'd be quite interesting to upload to show you the type of information and knowledge which some people in HR are learning at the moment. Do check that out on our YouTube if you're interested. But just to let you know, we do interactive things every single week until the end of time, or at least until end of December. And then we'll look again what we're going to do for next year. Autism and the complexities of effective treatment. Essentially, this webinar has had several names because I wasn't really sure what to call it. I've called it the dawn of autism, the beginning, understanding. Essentially, understanding what autism is may help us understand effective. Get our pitchforks and torches out. I'm not talking treatment in terms of cure, because autism is just a different way of being. But living with autism can sometimes suck because the world is very challenging and people haven't adapted to our mindsets. If we can understand it better, we might be able to find ways which can make life a little bit more comfortable. So that is the lens and the angle we're going down today. Quick overview, we're going to be looking at brain development, what happens in the early days, why do we have autism? Why don't we have ADHD? Why don't we have schizophrenia? You know, what makes autism autism and not something else? And then we're also going to be looking at the start of potential new aids to help people live better with autism or as an autistic adult. Some quick vocab, just because I may use some new terminology today, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Neurodevelopmental spectrum, essentially all the things going on in our head, all the cables that are connecting and sending messages. They are formed very early on, often in utero, which is within the womb. We've also got idiopathic, which, is not what it sounds. It's not being like a serial idiot. It just means that the cause is unknown. But if something is like, potentially you could argue that autism is idiopathic because we don't really know the cause, though we've got an idea. Fragile X is a condition which is heavily linked to autism. So most people with autism do not have Fragile X, but a lot of people with Fragile X have autism, and the same can be said for 22q11 deletion syndrome. Basically, Fragile X is a genetic condition causing intellectual disabilities. Autism doesn't equal intellectual disability, Fragile X does. And 22q is essentially when you're missing a chromosome. So, or like part of it. Again, very linked. Then we've got psychosis, which relates to hallucinations and delusions. Now, you might think this isn't to do with autism. We're going to be looking at actually the two aren't that far apart on a genetic level. Cognitive impairments. Cognitive is just how we think. Impairments means it's not working how we'd imagine, reduced thinking ability. And synapses, these are the connection between our little brain cells that actually gets messages from A to B. That we're all up to speed. Fingers crossed you'll know what we're getting onto. Now, how is autism part of brain development conditions? This question seems a bit odd at the start, but what I mean is we always say autism is a neurodevelopmental condition. Why? Why do we call it that? Why does it fit into this? When we talk about neurodivergent conditions such as ADHD, developmental language disorder, dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyspraxia, why are we lumping autism with this? I appreciate the wording of this is a little bit tricky, but any idea why you think autism belongs in this category of neurodevelopmental or okay, it's a condition from birth, yes, but it can also happen in utero, which is in the womb. So essentially, very, very early on. Now, but also most people, I think you can get, I got diagnosed for autism at about 3. Quite often, it's very obvious in the very early stages. People with autism have brains that work differently from those of neurotypical people. And you're saying because of that, that would then count as a brain development condition. Yeah, I think while there are some cases of acquired, say, dyslexia or acquired autism, they are different, but mostly we are talking about things that happen very early on. But I think, to be honest, this is a bit of a tricky question. I think we need to break it down further. So, what one actually describes autism? We know it is one thing, or actually, I'm not going to spoil anything, but do we think autism spectrum disorder, ASD, is a singular disorder, a collection of neurodevelopmental conditions, a mental health condition, or a physical disability? If you were to put your chips in, where are you going to place all your money? Oh, okay. Most people are saying a collection of neurodevelopmental conditions. Let's see what the computer says. Yes, it is. So it is not a single disorder. That would be way too simple. Autism is many, many different things that have similar characteristics. But what are those characteristics, do I hear you say? No, I don't hear anything. But if I did, I imagine you'd say social communication, social interaction, repetitive behavior, the holy trinity of autism, when these 3 characteristics combined, what you get in the middle is ASD. Now, obviously, you might be all over the thing. You might just have social communication, social interaction. But when you go into that overlapping area, this is when it's likely, possibly autism, or at least you'll get diagnosed with it. Now, there is always some dispute. Some people think there's more characteristics. Other people say it's not as simplistic as this, but this is the general thinking. In terms of physical disability, no, it's not. But obviously, it can make interacting with the world around you more challenging. In terms of mental health condition, no, it's not, but you are more likely to have mental health conditions. And as for a singular disorder, no, even though people used to think that back in the day. We know that it is a little bit of everything. That seems a lot. We should probably try to categorize it, or maybe not. Do you think we can categorize autism into specific types? Yes or no? Thumbs up or thumbs down? Oh, no, 100% no. That is very interesting because before, oh, okay, we got one. Before 2013, we were categorizing it. We're like, all right, we've got autism. We don't want to put that in that box there. Asperger's disorder. Well, okay, we've got people who seem to be very capable, but don't quite fit in. There's no intellectual challenges there. Okay, Asperger's, then childhood degenerate disorder, Rett's disorder. Then we got not otherwise specified. We used to categorize autism, right? Now, you'd think that is helpful, wouldn't you? But actually, it was oversimplifying it because what happened if instead of being there, you were in the middle, or you're in the middle there, or you had some characteristics of Rett's, but actually a lot of characteristics of autism, it was essentially pigeonholing you. It was meaning that support you get available is related to X, where you might have XYZ. This is why they combined them two and just called it ASD. While it is useful to have more niche terms to help someone understand, it can also be a bit of a limiting factor. Oh, we have our first mystery question. What's the difference between social interaction and communication? Well, one is verbal, how you talk with the world, and one is how you interact with the world. It could be body language, facial expressions, those type of things, just different types of communication. All right, next question is, what is a neurodevelopmental disorders? Okay, there should be an S on that. I answered it already, but if we're going deeper down the rabbit hole, can we go beyond the fact that it is just something which happens in birth? Are there any other overlapping characteristics which would make something neurodevelopmental? We often talk about what counts as being neurodivergent and what doesn't, but as we know, neurodiversity is a concept, it is a movement, it's why there isn't a rigid definition of what it is and what it isn't. Whereas neurodevelopmental, that is a scientific term. There are clear parameters on what counts and what does not count. Affects brain development. Yes, absolutely. Anyone else? Any other takers? Do you think, are there any other things which group all of these together? Bear in mind, I do have a nice little image here which says some of the things. Well, I'll give you the answers then. So, memory problems, yes, they overlap, definitely. So, most neurodevelopmental disorders will have the following common. They'll have memory problems, cognitive function impairment, altered social interactions, compulsive behavior. All these things are things which all of the conditions have in common. They overlap, which makes it really, really difficult in order to know what is one and what is the other. Again, like, is it autism? Is it ADHD? Is it Rett? Or is it Fragile X? Unless we're looking on a genetic level, are we always able to tell what something is just by observing it? Here we have this magic wheel of developmental disorder origins. What is going on and what creates this way of thinking? You could have birth trauma. Coming out could be traumatic, could lead to it. Brain tumor, not very frequent, by the way, but possible. Head injuries. Not some of it is very, very much developmental, but that could contribute. Infections in birth, that could be another thing. Your metabolic disorder, how your body processes, immune dysfunctions, nutrition. These are areas which could impact whether or not you have a neurodevelopmental disorder. So let's look at this little spinny wheel, because there are many different things which can contribute. Bear in mind, we do not know what causes autism, idiopathic, but these are all contributing factors. First of all, genetics. Basically, your DNA. Are we born to have autism because it runs in our genetics? Is it out of our control? In some ways, yes. But in other ways, genetics have an off-on switch. For instance, maybe environmental factors might trigger those genetics to activate. Other times, they always will. What else do we have? We have early onset. So most, if not all, neurodevelopmental disorders happen at very, very early on. You don't hear people like in their 50s suddenly becoming autistic. You do, however, hear them getting diagnosed. So remember, that's a difference. Just because you were diagnosed later in life doesn't mean that you have only just got it. You always have. What else do we have in this spinny wheel? Environmental factors, yes. Pollution, smoke, toxins, poor water, food, all these things can contribute. We've also got, for life, yes, knowing that once you have it for life. You cannot get rid of it, because essentially it is in the early stages of being a human being. Your DNA is busy encoding, wiring itself, crossing the T's, dotting the I's. And once it's done, it is done. We know that it is very, very complex. Now, in the scientific term, complex doesn't just mean difficult. It means that it is not just one thing. It isn't just like, oh, you didn't eat your vegetables, autism. It is a matter of many, many different things. And when we're looking from the genes, there isn't some magical holy grail autism gene. It's genes that are all slightly impacted. And this is why autism is different for everyone, because on a genetic level, it genuinely is different for everyone. And let's see what other last two we've got. And the brain development. How the brain develops, that has a massive impact. Oh, Vicky says, in our family, there's definitely genetics at play. My husband, his sister, and our children are all autistic. Yes, definitely is. But it doesn't mean that any future children or their children are guaranteed to have autism, but it will probably be in the genetics. Environmental or genetic? What are we thinking? Which of these ND disorders are predominantly environmental or genetics? We've got ASD, autism spectrum disorder. We have schizophrenia. We have ADHD, attention deficit disorder. We have congenital rubella and potatal alcohol syndrome and Fragile X. Now, some of these you might think, I've not heard of them before. They don't sound overly autistic. Well, remember, they're all neurodevelopmental disorders. They happen in the womb or in birth or very, very early. Once again, we're not completely certain, but likely it's probably maybe near enough genetics, but we don't know 100%. Environmental factors do play a part. Schizophrenia, well, that often presents itself in adolescence during your informative years. While genetics is a big part of it, it is often activated almost due to environmental factors. ADHD, yep, very much genetic, as far as I'm aware. Rubella, a bit of both. Alcohol syndrome, well, yes, environment. It is, again, a bit of both. Essentially, if your parents drank a lot of alcohol and you had an addiction, the child might have something when it comes on. If your parent is addicted to drugs, then you as a child may also have a drug addiction. So none of these are completely one or the other. And Fragile X is definitely genetic. Well, actually, I say definitely, as far as the knowledge goes. Now, what neurodevelopmental traits do you have? So here is 1, 2, 3, 4. Here are 5 traits of things which neurodevelopmental disorders typically have one or the other or more. And depending on where you get, will say whether or not you're diagnosed with A or whether you're diagnosed with B. So would you say you have traits of psychosis? Do you have traits of social difficulties? Do you have traits of cognitive impairments, mania, or depression? So on here, you're rating, we're seeing what we got here, and this will help a clinician or a psychiatrist able to diagnose you. Like I see at the moment, a lot of people are saying, not me. It's going to be different for everyone, but let's have a look. Here's an example of 2 separate conditions. You see here, they both got the same outside, but one has high psychosis levels, one has high negative symptoms, yet the other one has very low psychosis. And believe it or not, on the left is schizophrenia, and on the right is autism. As you see, they're really not that dissimilar. It's just its amount of how much a particular characteristic may affect you. In schizophrenia, psychosis really high. In autism, it's quite low. In schizophrenia, there's high cognitive impairment. In autism, there's also high cognitive impairment. As you can see, but autism, you'll see depression can be quite high. In schizophrenia, that's less of a factor, apparently. It's really interesting to see how all of these things, what makes autism and schizophrenia is not binary. It's more of a scale. So, for instance, while this is the textbook definition on what each condition is or is not, you, for instance, might have like mid-level psychosis. So in that case, do you have schizophrenia or do you have autism? You can see why the call on whether or not to diagnose someone is really challenging. This lovely bloke, Emil, or this fella, who is often considered the godfather of modern psychiatry, he has this quite a useful quote, which I think even back then lets you know that they knew that these diagnostic labels were not perfect. No experienced psychiatrist will deny that there is an alarmingly large number of cases in which it seems impossible, in spite of most careful observation, to make a diagnosis. So what he is saying here is even if you have the absolute best psychiatrist, you have the most time, the most care, there are going to be some instances where just a clear observation is not going to be appropriate or enough in order to get the diagnosis. And this is where we are. At the moment, it's reliant a lot. So you could go to several different psychiatrists and they could diagnose you all differently, potentially. While there are parameters which should hopefully safeguard this, there's always an error of judgment. Now here are some overlapping areas: schizophrenia and autism. If we want to diagnose you with one and not the other, these are all going to be problem areas because these are all things that both disorders demonstrate. So social deficits, yep, we've got that in schizophrenia and autism. Genetic components, yep, that's in both of them. Both neurodevelopmental disorders, check, check, check. Deficits in executive function, check. And brain abnormalities, yeah, check. So if you're diagnosing someone and you were to only look at these factors, you could probably see why it's going to be very difficult and why labels alone are not going to give you the whole picture. So here's a question. Why do risk factors lead to ASD in some and schizophrenia in others? So why do some people in the womb get autism and some get schizophrenia of potential? Why do smoking or poor food increase the likelihood of one and not the other? It's curious. You could have two people who have exact same experiences, yet one will get one and the other will get the other. Don't worry, give this a go if you have an idea. We do not have an answer, by the way. You can't really get this right or wrong. At the moment, it's just having a feel. Okay, genetic predisposition. Yes, I mean, that is actually a really good answer, meaning that in your DNA, there are some people who are more likely to get one thing over the other, maybe due to previous family conditions. So, for instance, if schizophrenia runs in the family, more likely to get schizophrenia over autism. But then again, we do often get people who have no background of these conditions that they're aware of, and yet they still end up getting a condition. We also know that you could have autism and schizophrenia. Well, how does that work then? So you can see there's a lot of questions which are very grey or we still need answers for. Now, what influences brain development? So I put this image here of a smoking baby. Unfortunately, this is true. The kid, he smoked a dozen a day. Now, is this going to impact him years later? Almost definitely. Because again, sometimes it's due to your genetic disposition. We all know that person who smoked a packet every single day for 50 odd years and was completely fine. And then someone who never smoked at all and got lung cancer. These things, what they do, they increase the likelihood and the risk. They don't guarantee it. Now, when we're talking about brain development, we're not just talking about the infant. It could also be the parent. Is the parent popping pills? Is the parent going on roller coasters? What other things could impact the brain in early development? We always see when you look at packets, you're like, yeah, pregnant women definitely shouldn't be doing this. Those things are on the packets because it can have impact on the development. But it's worth knowing. Anything that can influence brain development. It's more than just alcohol and smoking, by the way. There are many, many, many different things. Oh, Louise says, my son is both autistic and schizophrenic. Thanks for sharing that. And it shows you that even though it's complicated, isn't it? And when it comes to treating someone, knowing what is not. Yep, nutrition. For instance, if you grow up in poverty, you are potentially more likely because it's going to affect your early development. Education your parents had? I don't know. There's lots of different factors which could be contributing. But remember how we said autism is a complex disorder, meaning that there isn't just one particular thing. It is many, many, many in very small little scales. Interactions, absolutely. This diagram shows you some of the factors which make up our brain development. We've got prenatal, which is before you're even born, and postnatal, once you're born. We've got parental and maternal. So, maternal, basically the mum, the dad. The mum's essentially nicotine, alcohol, toxins, infections, stress. These are all things which you should ideally avoid. Stress is a really big one that a lot of people do not take as serious. Being stressed is as if not more dangerous than some of these toxins. Okay, let's say your mum has had a little bit too much to drink while you were bopping about in the stomach or wherever babies come from. Then we go into the genetic makeup, And okay, we've got oxygen. Maybe if you get starved of oxygen or you don't have enough, maybe if there's a different distribution of hormones, that could affect it. We've got the structural brain development, transmitter systems. Maybe they aren't forming the way they should. We've got fetal growth. Maybe you're growing at a slower or faster rate than what would be expected. Then the birth, offspring behavior, vulnerabilities, and mental health. If a child is exposed to extreme stresses or trauma early on, this could also significantly impact the development because the brain isn't fully developed as it comes out. It's still a soft little egg, and there's many room for things to go wrong. And then environmental adversaries. If, again, you're born into poverty, you might not get all the nutrition or have access to the best support available. As you can see, it is a bumpy road during pregnancy, and this is why it's important. But a lot of the time, these factors are out of our hands. You can't help it if maybe there's secondhand smoke, depending if you fall or there's pollutants in the air, some things we just can't control. Maybe we can't afford to have the best possible diets. And even if we were to avoid all of these, you could still have a neurodevelopmental disorder. They do not guarantee that you have it or do not have it. They just increase the likelihood. Okay, Louise says, I was very stressed when pregnant because the father was absent. And thanks for sharing that. And you know what? That's a thing that was out of your control. Please, one thing I want to make it really clear, getting autism or a neurodevelopmental disorder is not anyone's fault. It's things that are without our control, and we are still learning about exactly what triggers it. We just know that these are things which contribute. Okay, we've got, Anya says, do you think that trauma of grandparents or parents could affect children/grandchildren development? I think there's a lot of research going into that, but yes. And the reason why is when we go through trauma, it alters our brain chemistry. If you notice, this is why if you have trauma at a very early age, you might suffer mental health years later because it has altered your connections. And if those connections get deep rooted into your DNA, then it can get passed down. So things can get passed down from generations and generations. As to exactly how much, the jury is still out. One-size-fits-all diagnosis do not work. Do you agree or don't agree? And this will be interesting. What do I mean is, if we just say, does having the autistic diagnosis, is it good or bad? Schizophrenia, good or bad? Or do we need something a little bit more nuanced? Now, this could go both ways because we had multiple diagnoses and that didn't work. We went for a one-size-fits-all. But then by having a one-size-fits-all, it leaves so much room for additional questions and ambiguity. I'm actually surprised a lot of you agreed. I thought there'd be a bit more of disagree. I think there's pros and cons. Having a one diagnosis to rule them all is beneficial because it means that it is purposefully ambiguous. It doesn't want to give you all the information because it wants you to know it's more complicated than that. But on the other hand, you can't expect everyone to be an expert in autism, and people might just say, I know one person with autism. The other person who told me you have autism must also have similar characteristics. Okay, what we got? C. Hazel, thanks so much for the insight. I have been concerned about having a biological kid because I somehow thought the child would definitely have depression and ASD. Good to know it's more of a probability than a certainty. Well, absolutely. And do not ever stop that from having kids if that's something that you wanted to do. You definitely aren't at risk. All I would say is if you know that you have a family history, just try and be as careful as you possibly can. Follow all the medical advice, but there is no guarantee whatsoever. That being said, though, there has been tests on twins. And if a twin has autism, the other one is twice as likely to have autism as well. When it comes to genetically similar individuals, there is a high likelihood, but the likelihood of twins, I don't know, but is quite small. And also it's not a guarantee either. Now, there is many, many areas for further investigation, exploration. We are at the very beginning of this journey to understand how the brain works and how it develops. Just some areas which are emerging, which I encourage you to keep a eagle eye out on is autism treatments. Whether or not you agree with autism treatments is a personal thing. I think treatment is more about helping you live the best version of your life as possible in the world we have around us. We've also got synaptic activities. Remember, essentially in your nervous system, where you got the brain cells, looking at what happens there. We've got measuring glutamate. For those of you who weren't at our previous webinar, we talked about dopamine, but also glutamate in terms of the chemicals in our head might have more of an impact on conditions ADHD than we originally gave it credit for. GABA studies. GABA is another neurotransmitter, one that deserves more research. We've also got how the body responds to drugs in individuals with ASD, different microglia activations. In our brain, we've got our neurons that I'm always banging on about. Neurons are basically held up with scaffolding, and the scaffolding is like microglia, but they have more of an important role than purely being scaffolding. That's what they were originally known. We've got the mutation or modification of glutamate. There are so many areas for us still to explore and to investigate. To simply put it down to as straightforward as, oh, you smoked when you were pregnant, or you had alcohol, or your family has it, would be far, far, far too simplistic and probably wrong. So do know that autism is complex. It is a multiple of factors, and one singular thing that someone does probably isn't going to be the deciding factor on whether or not someone is or is not. The key takeaways that you can take away with you today and remember forevermore is that autism is within a broader neurodevelopmental spectrum. So we talk about autism being a spectrum. That is a spectrum within a spectrum. Think of it like the multiverse. There are many different areas. While autism can demonstrate itself in many different ways, its relationship to other conditions such as ADHD, schizophrenia, bipolar, isn't as different as maybe we might have originally thought. I know, was it last week, Emma, you briefly mentioned that you thought, well, maybe ASD and ADHD are maybe the same thing. And I think there is, and these questions are being opened. Oh, but I love blaming my mum. I mean, you can still blame your mum if you want, but she could blame her mum, and she could blame her mum. And then you could blame it all the way down to the first human. Okay. We also know that mixed genetics and environmental causes for these disorders, it's a mixture. We're probably looking at genetics, but environmental definitely has its part to play. Having a diagnosis is a tricky thing, and people can get them wrong because there is much overlapping, and sometimes it's just about what you're demonstrating on that particular day when you're having your assessment. It doesn't always take in all the nuances. Also, when we look at that pesky DSM, that's Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, they typically don't take environmental factors into consideration. So it's actually a very two-dimensional way of understanding conditions. Oh, Louise, mums get blamed for everything. And don't worry, that's why I'm saying it's not the mum's fault. Please know that. Back in the old 50s, there was the refrigerator mother theory, which completely blamed autism on the mum, and it was completely and utterly disproven, yet people still think it. So, not the mum's fault. Hopefully we can put that to bed. Oh, Vicky, in our house, it's the dad's fault. Okay, well, it's not the dad's fault either. It's no one's fault, okay? No one's fault. And we say fault, it's a bad thing. Remember that autism isn't as simple as good or bad. It is a spectrum, and there are many beautiful things that come as a result of having their differently wired mind. We also know that there are shared risk factors, and understanding one can offer insight into the other. Even though when I talk about other conditions, schizophrenia, you might be like, whoa, this ain't what I signed up for. Do know that learning one can give more context and understanding about how the other is. Oh, Anna says, I realize that in children, they often give autism diagnosis to any child who presents differently in their development, especially when they have no explanation. That's why autism is a spectrum within the spectrum, he said. Yeah, and said beforehand, they used to just diagnose you as otherwise specified because you didn't meet that people were expecting. It's just one diagnosis. And this is to make sure that no matter how you demonstrate your differences, you would still be eligible for support. Because ultimately, a diagnosis is created in order to make sure that you have access to support. Who cares if you don't tick every single box? If you would benefit from the support, then a diagnosis could be a really valuable asset to have. Here is some further research that you might want to check out. If you want further details on these, just get in contact. And another thing is this book, which it's a beastie of a book. I don't say you have to read it, but if you want to learn more and you want to take your reading to your understanding to the next level, The Neuroscience of Autism Spectrum Disorder, which came back in 2013, but still has some really interesting gems, is definitely worth to check out. It's not exactly what I'd call bedtime reading, but it's still a useful book. Now, if you want to catch up with this webinar and future and previous ones, do sign up to our YouTube channel. Click that little subscribe button. It will take you to our channel and you can see previous ones that we've got going on us. And oh, look, nearly 4,000 subscribers. Look at us go. Slow and steady wins the race. And here's our contact details if you ever want to get in contact, find out more about what we do, and etc., etc. And hopefully I will see you next week.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Bye. See you.
Bye. Thanks for coming. Always appreciate all of you.